You're listening to Stimulus Tech Talk, a conversation-based podcast created by Stimulus Technologies that covers a range of topics related to business and technology.
Welcome to Stimulus Tech Talk. I am Sherry Lipp, Marketing Manager here at Stimulus Technologies, and I am here with our CEO, Nathan Whittacre, and today we are going to be talking about the MGM hack that recently happened. Hello, Nathan.
Hey, Sherry, and hello, everybody. Not a wonderful topic to talk about, but let's talk about it.
No, but definitely an interesting one and one that a lot of people have questions about. So can you start out with a little overview of what the attack was?
Yeah, so it appears that it's primarily started with a social engineering attack on the IT Helpdesk of MGM. So it appears from public knowledge that the attackers found out some of the individuals that would have administrative access to their network and called the IT Helpdesk and convinced them to reset this administrator's password and two-factor authentication information, which the help desk proceeded to do, which gave them initial access into the network. So that was the first step of the attack. The attack appears to have gone on, and this is where it gets a little more technical. MGM uses a piece of software called Okta that gives authentication information across their network. And is linked into a lot of the systems inside their network, servers, a lot of the data centers and things like that. And so once they were able to get into the network, they were able to exploit some vulnerabilities in this software, Okta, which gave them access to most of the virtual servers on the network. Virtual servers are just servers that live on physical machines, but they can have multiple servers running on a single piece of hardware, which most enterprises use. So once they had access to those, it appears that they held and demanded a ransom from MGM and told them if they did not pay the ransom that they would shut down their entire infrastructure. MGM refused to pay the ransom, which the hackers ended up taking down the entire network. And it appeared to have damaged most of their systems for approximately 10 days. They were able to bring some of the systems up slowly. But, for those that you haven't seen in the news or, reading the press, you couldn't book anything online. Most of their websites were down. They couldn't process credit cards. A lot of their floor machines were offline. Their reservation system and room management system was offline, so you couldn't get into your hotel room. They ended up having to give physical keys to people to get into hotel rooms. So it really disrupted their operations for all their 30 plus hotel casinos throughout the world. Very disruptive attack, and they appear to be mostly back up and running now from the public view, but it interestingly enough, I think a big note on this is they did not pay the ransom, but not too shortly before this attack, Caesars Entertainment, which is another global entertainment company, was ransomed the same way against the same systems, this Okta system. And Caesars Entertainment did pay the ransom, and we didn't know about this publicly because none of their systems went down because they were willing to pay millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars in a ransom to keep their systems up. So, and this is an ethical question. Maybe we could talk about this a little bit more, but, should you or should you not pay the ransom? And where does this lead to? So that's the tough question out of this, because we have a case study of two major casino hotel conglomerates that one paid the ransom, stayed up and running, the other one did not pay the ransom and was taken offline.
Yeah, and I'm sure from a customer standpoint, what they really care about is that they can get back in their room and play their, have the vacation that they had planned. So I can see that it can be a tough decision. But you had talked about in our previous episode on ransomware that there could be some legal repercussions for paying a ransom, that you could be aiding a criminal organization.
So yeah, that's been an issue because a lot of these ransoms go eventually to fund terrorist organizations, and so the Treasury Department has been going after organizations that have paid these ransoms um, without consulting the government, and fined or potentially criminal charges against these organizations because eventually this money gets funneled to terrorist organizations to buy weapons or maybe drugs or whatever it may be that is used by these foreign entities. Interestingly enough, this hacking group is a U.S. based hacking group. So I don't know if that plays into it by any means, but I'm sure the MGM has been working with the appropriate authorities, and same with Caesars, to make that decision. And so this is one recommendation I would say is if you are ever in the situation of being ransomed, um, just like if one of your kids was held hostage or your spouse or whatever it may be, I don't know if you would negotiate directly with the kidnappers or the terrorists. So I think the most important thing is to bring in the proper authorities first if you ever have these ransoms, whether it's a small ransom on one computer or tens of millions of dollar ransom on your entire network. Having the proper authorities and consulting with them, I think, is essential. Because if you were doing this in any other situation, you would absolutely call the police or the FBI or whoever is going to be negotiating this. So don't go through this on your own. And I'm sure the MGM and Caesars were made that decision in conjunction with the authorities.
Right. So do you think this attack, was there more of a vulnerability on the human side, human error side, or within because of the setup with the software?
I think it's both, and that's what a lot of these attacks happen. Is that this is a very sophisticated attack. Um, publicly, MGM and Caesars publicly acknowledged that they were using this piece of software, or this solution by Okta, this vendor, and publicly there was a known vulnerability in this if you had access to the system. So I think that's the first key information is these hackers were able to garner from press releases or public information who the customers of the software were, and then gather a lot of information on, who may have the credentials to get into the system. So, this was obviously the back end of it was a sophisticated social engineering attack, which this attack may not have worked if the social engineering didn't work. So that was the gateway in. But on top of that, it was again a sophisticated technical attack once they were able to access the network. So this wasn't they logged in to shut down a server. They were making sure that they had access to everything on the network, so they could demand the highest price and say, if you don't pay it, we're going to take everything down. Um, and it may be that they were calling a bluff, thinking that the hackers were calling a bluff, which they weren't. So very sophisticated, both on the front end to get the social engineering attack and on the back end to be able to, make sure that they had access to the entire network before they demanded this. And I'm sure this was, months or years in planning and a lot of time and energy by these hackers to do it. Now, do they do that on, a small business that, might have, $1 million in revenue, not the billions of revenue that these huge entertainment companies? They might. I mean, depending on the data and the complexity of what they're looking for. It's definitely that's the question: are you putting up enough barriers to entry to make it worth it? And obviously, a $30 million ransom, which appears to be about the range that was paid, was enough for them to spend the time to get through all these barriers. Whereas, maybe a $10,000 ransom might, they're not going to spend months and months on planning and executing this attack on a small business. But small business defenses usually aren't as strong as these large enterprises.
And how can these attackers, they get paid this huge ransom? Is it completely untraceable where that money goes and who they are?
Um, it's very difficult to trace. It appears that the government has been able to trace some of these Bitcoin attacks. So most of the ransoms are paid in cryptocurrency, which is generally very difficult, if not impossible, to trace. So Bitcoin has shown some vulnerabilities in tracing. And I think these attackers are moving somewhat away from Bitcoin because there is some traceability to it. But there's other cryptocurrency out there that is untraceable, and so that's it's a conglomeration of technologies that have really caused the explosion of ransomware attacks. Whether it's a ransomware on your machine that just encrypts all your data, or this very sophisticated ransom attack, and they wouldn't be as easily executed if somebody was demanding a wire or ACH transfer or a bag of cash left at a garbage can on the corner, whatever it may be. So the fact that cryptocurrency allows for this mostly anonymous or completely anonymous transfer of funds has given these criminals a conduit to demand these ransoms.
Right. And so is there other ways to safeguard, if there is a breach, especially, coming through a help desk or, some kind of support line, are there more safeguards you could put in place that they couldn't get access to the entire network?
So that is something that we are really talking about inside of a security infrastructure. Is I would say the first thing, especially for small businesses, is to ensure that the accounts that you're using as your primary working accounts, the things that you do the work on, are do not have administrative privileges. So a lot of small businesses, you might have access to your Office 365 environment or your servers, Active Directory, things like that, and it's the same account that you use to log into your PC every day. And one of the things I'd recommend, specifically for small businesses, you have a separate administrative account for each user, so you can, you don't have just one global admin account that the password's shared, but each user has their special admin account, and you only use that account in the event that you need to do administrative work. I don't know if we have enough details to say that would have prevented this attack. Quite possibly, if this user had called up to the IT help desk and they were just resetting a non-administrative account that just had, very basic user level access on the network, the attack might have not been possible. We don't know that. That's a speculation. But I can say for small businesses, it would definitely limit the ability to these hackers to get further access into the network. So that would be one thing. Multi-factor authentication, even though it was bypassed in this regard, I think is essential. Something that we're discussing, because this, as an IT supplier, this is affecting us in our industry considerably, is, a way to authenticate better the user that's contacting the help desk to ensure that that user actually is who they are. Because social engineering is generally convincing somebody else to do something they wouldn't necessarily want to do. And so, the first thing that we have to do is authenticate who the user is. So even though it's annoying, if you're calling your bank now, a lot of times they'll send you a link or have you, read back some type of, two-factor authentication if you call them, or, if you're logging into banking websites, things like that. I would say, as any critical infrastructure, make sure you have two-factor authentication set up. And then if you're supporting from an IT help desk, we really should never be resetting that two-factor authentication without, some type of, third authentication to ensure the person we're talking to is who they really are. So it's, those are the two things I would say: is non-administrative accounts for all users for their daily work, and then making sure you have two-factor authentication set up for for all accounts. And, going one step further, if you could do biometric authentication for, these administrative type accounts, things like fingerprint scanners or retinal scanners, things like that, provide so much additional security because you have to physically be the person doing that. So unless that person's, held at a gunpoint, maybe out of some type of, Ocean's 11 movie or something like that, that might happen. But, I don't know if the attackers would lose their anonymity if they were, forcing somebody to physically, scan their fingerprints. So there's definitely a lot of things to do. I think for small businesses, though, don't need to go that sophisticated yet. But those are things that I would recommend today.
And what do you think we learned? I mean, from each of these attacks, I'm assuming we learned a lot more about cybersecurity. I mean, from a small business standpoint, do you think there are ways to have that I don't know what the chain of command was there, but where it's not just that somebody is forced to get that second set of eyes or approval before they can make that kind of decision.
Well, I think we have to go back to, and that's a very good comment. We have to go back to our roots of what is two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. And it doesn't have to always be electronic. I think in small business, especially, looking at different things and different vulnerabilities inside the organization, such as, payments to vendors, wire transfers, ACH transfers, these things that are costing companies a lot of money, ensuring that, or heck, buying, gift cards from Amazon, because the CEO is on vacation, the old, the attack that's so common today. I think people are less willing to pick up the phone to, verify who that is. And I think, or, walk down the office or, have another method to authenticate the person's actually making the request. So that would be something that I would recommend for small businesses to think about is there other methods to authenticate somebody if if you're getting an electronic communication, making sure that you have a non-electronic way to ensure that the request is valid.
What do you think are some ways? I think we talk about this a lot with employee training. Do you think that could help in all situations of cybersecurity where somebody, with these social engineering phishing attacks, and it's such a big company, I think people are kind of confused at like, how could it get past that kind of security?
Again, as we talk about often, it just takes one person doing something wrong a lot of times. And it could have been all the proper training and everything. And, that's the unfortunate part is, we have to be in security at right 100% of the time. The hackers only have to be right once. And, it's certainly a scary thing out there. I would say for small businesses, again, because the financial gain for these hackers is much smaller than a huge business like MGM, putting up enough barriers in place for so that they move on to the next target and find a target that's much easier to get into, which is honestly, most small businesses don't have the mechanisms in place to protect themselves. So, you're starting out right. If you're listening to this podcast, you're getting a little bit of training on this. Hopefully you take some of these things back, especially the multi-factor authentication, the administrative rights, things like that, and make those changes inside your organization. But continued, discussion of this inside your team, I think is really important. And just, the awareness that these attacks are happening, not just to large companies, but to small businesses every day. And, making sure your entire team is aware of it so that they are vigilant. So the training, Stimulus provides weekly training, annual assessments for all your team. If you don't have that, make sure you get something like that in place. And then just from a top down, making sure that, you're creating a culture of security inside your organization. In my book, we talk about that a lot, just it needs to be top down. The owner all the way on down needs to dictate that culture of security to protect the entire organization.
Yeah, and we talked about this was a major hack on a major company, worldwide organization. But for smaller business, do you think that the objective may not be money so much as like gaining access to private information?
Certainly, and that could have happened here too. I think MGM and Caesars could have an issue on their hands with the information these attackers got access to. But small businesses, we all have information that the hackers want, whether it's employee information like social security numbers, bank account routing information for their personal accounts. It could be your clients' credit card numbers. So there's a lot of personal information that these attackers need. And because, the hacking is so prolific now, the price per credit card number, the price per social security number that they can get on the dark web is so much lower. They have to get so many more. So they're willing to come into, even smaller organizations and, get 10 social security numbers and a couple of hundred credit card numbers, whereas before they were targeting much larger organizations. But they just have to get more and more of these to make their job worth it for them. So we all have information that they want, and they may be in and out of your system without you even knowing it. They just need to monitor and watch for that information for a period of time, and then they may hold you for ransom, or they may leave your system with the information that they were looking for. So there's a lot of ways that these attackers are going after organizations all the time.
Yeah, definitely important information. And Nathan, do you want to say the name of your book?
Sure. So it's the CEO's Digital Survival Guide. You can see a copy of it back there. It's available on Amazon on October 10th. It's getting published. So we're very excited for the book. I try to make it a little lighthearted, a lot of stories and ways to implement these things that we're talking about on the podcast and the webinar series. We go into much more detail in the book and just make it relevant for the owner CEO so that they know the things that are most important for them to implement inside the organization.
Yeah, we're definitely looking forward to talking more about that, which we will, and more about keeping your businesses safe. And thank you, everybody. Thanks, Nathan.
Thanks for being here. Thanks, Sherry, for putting it together always.